This is the 13th part of the word embedding series. Today we are going to look at the architecture of the FastText model. In the previous two videos, we covered FastText's subword model and the hashing trick. This time we will build on those concepts and design the FastText architecture. In particular, we will focus on the FastText architecture based on negative sampling. Let's begin by reviewing how FastText learns. FastText is built on top of the skipgram model. In a previous video, we looked at the following skipgram negative sampling model. Let's briefly review how this model works. A target word and a context word are fed into the input layer as a pair. They pass through embedding layers that generate embedding vectors for the two words. The dot product of the two vectors is then computed. The result is passed through a sigmoid activation function, and the final output is sent to the output layer. The model is trained so that positive pairs produce an output close to 1, while negative pairs produce an output close to 0. The objective function of this network is the log likelihood function shown here. Through backpropagation, the embedding matrices V and Vpre are updated using gradient ascent to maximize this objective function. The overall architecture of the FastText model is very similar to this. Just like in Word2Vec, this model also takes a target word and a context word as input. However, unlike Word2Vec, the target word is decomposed into character n-grams, or subwords. Instead of using a standard word embedding layer, FastText uses a hash table to store subword embeddings. Each subword is mapped to a row in the hash table. The embedding vectors of all the subwords are then summed together to produce the vector representation of the target word. Meanwhile, the context word is passed through a standard embedding layer, which produces its embedding vector. In the FastText paper, context words are not decomposed into subwords. Instead, a standard embedding layer is used for context words, just as in Word2Vec. Next, we compute the dot product between the target word vector and the context word vector. The scoring function can be written as follows. This function is presented in section 3.1, General Model of the FastText paper. The result is then passed through a sigmoid activation function and sent to the output layer. Just as in Word2Vec, the model is trained so that positive pairs produce outputs close to 1, while negative pairs produce outputs close to 0. The objective function of this network is the negative log likelihood function shown here. This formula also appears in section 3.1 of the paper. This loss function is simply the skipgram log likelihood function shown on the left, except that the sign is reversed. Although the notation looks slightly different, the two formulations are fundamentally equivalent. More precisely, the original skipgram model uses gradient ascent to maximize the log likelihood function. FastText instead uses gradient descent to minimize the negative log likelihood function. Through backpropagation, the parameters of the hash table and the context embedding layer are updated using gradient descent. Since the gradient flows through two separate branches, the two parameter sets are updated independently. Now let's think about the following question. Why doesn't FastText decompose context words into subwords? The biggest reason is computational efficiency. If context words were also decomposed into subwords, the scoring function would need to look like this. In this case, all subword vectors would need to be summed together, which becomes much more computationally expensive when negative sampling is used. This is because in negative sampling, many more negative context words are sampled than positive ones. As a side note, as we discussed in the video on skipgram negative sampling, the number of negative pairs per positive pair is typically between 5 and 20 for small data sets, and between 2 and 5 for very large data sets. For this reason, the FastText model likely uses a standard embedding layer for context words instead of decomposing them into subwords. Although this is not explicitly stated in the paper, this can be inferred from the formulas and the model definition. There is another reason as well. Just like in Word2Vec, once training is complete, only the target side representation is used during inference. After training, the context embedding layer is no longer used. Since only the target side hash table is used during inference, OOV problems do not arise. This is because even if an OOV word is given to the target side, all of its subwords are mapped to the hash table and an embedding vector can be produced. In short, FastText decomposes only the target word into subwords in order to enable OOV generalization while keeping the computational cost manageable. Next, let's look at the inference process. Once training is complete, only the left side of the model, that is the target side, is used during inference. This is the final inference model. When a word is fed into the input layer, it is decomposed into character n-grams. The corresponding subword vectors are then retrieved from the hash table and summed together. This gives us the embedding vector for the input word. For example, if we input the word where, the model produces its embedding vector through this process. In other words, the model generates word vectors based on the morphological structure of words. This is one of the key advantages of FastText. Even if we input an out-of-vocabulary word such as twere, the model still decomposes it into subwords and generates an embedding vector for it. Even though the word itself does not exist in the vocabulary, the model can still infer a meaningful vector representation. Since many of the subwords of twere overlap with those of where, the two vectors will likely be very similar in the embedding space. This is how FastText can generate embeddings for out-of-vocabulary words by leveraging morphologically similar words. Next, let's look at the data structures used in FastText training. Let's say we have a very simple corpus like this. First, we build a vocabulary from the corpus. Each word in the vocabulary is assigned a unique integer ID called a token ID. Next, we convert each sentence into a sequence of token IDs like this. The first word of the first sentence is deep, which has token ID 6. And the second word, learning, has token ID 1. In this way, every sentence in the corpus is represented as a sequence of token IDs. Next, we generate positive and negative samples from these sequences. Let's say the word with token ID 7 is the center word, or the target word. Then the surrounding context words have token IDs 6, 1, 8, and 9. This example uses a window size of 2, meaning that words within 2 positions of the center word are treated as context words. The method for generating negative samples is exactly the same as in Word2Vec. Positive pairs are assigned the label 1, while negative pairs are assigned the label 0. Since the details of negative sampling were already covered in depth in the 9th video of this series, we will not repeat them here. Next, we combine the positive and negative samples into a single dataset and shuffle them. The first column contains target words. The second column contains context words. The third column contains labels. The word corresponding to token ID 29 is build, and the word corresponding to token ID 30 is web. This dataset will be used as the training input for the FastText model. Now let's feed the first training example into the model. The target word first needs to be decomposed into subwords. Decomposing the word build into character n-grams gives us the following subwords. Each subword is mapped to a row index in the hash table. The first subword maps to row 21, and the second subword maps to row 29. Note that different subwords may sometimes map to the same hash index. This is the hash collision problem we discussed in the previous video. We repeat this process for all target words to obtain their hash table indices. As we saw previously, this can be done efficiently using a hash function. At this point, the training data is ready. The hash indices of the target word build are fed into the left input layer. The token ID 30 corresponding to the context word web is fed into the right input layer. The model is then trained so that the output layer produces the label 1. Finally, let's briefly look at how the model can be modified if we also decompose the context words into subwords. If we want the model to also capture the morphological structure of context words, we can modify the architecture like this. The context word is decomposed into subwords, and a hash table is used instead of a standard embedding layer. The context word vector can then be obtained using the following formula. The scoring function would then look like this. The rest of the model remains unchanged. Additionally, we can design the model so that the target word and the context word share a single hash table, as shown in the architecture on the right. In this case, gradients from both branches flow into the same hash table. As a result, the shared parameters may potentially learn richer representations. However, this also increases the computational cost since context words must now be decomposed into subwords as well. It is likely that the authors considered the additional computational cost too high relative to the potential gain. That wraps up our discussion of the basic FastText architecture. In the next video, we will implement this model from scratch based on the architecture we discussed today.